Okay, today is the 15th of December, 2017. It's also the day of Hanukkah. Heavenly Family, we thank you so much for this Feast of Dedication. Thank you for the opportunity to investigate it and to learn the truth about that time in history and how it can affect us and inspire us even for today. We thank you for guiding us into all truth, for a love of the truth, for teaching us to identify with the truth and nothing else, and for teaching us to love correction, which is the only way we can really truly come to the truth. And so we praise you for all of these things. I pray your hand of blessing upon this meeting, upon our minds and hearts. And we ask these things, Father and Mother, in the name of your son and daughter, the branch he and the branch she. Amen. Okay, so this is Hanukkah for this year. It is an 8-day feast starting in the Hebrew month of Kislev. It's the 9th month of the year on the 25th of Kislev. And just wanted to recap. Last year we went through the Antiquities of the Jews, basically starting, in chapter 4, I believe. And we went through chapter 8. So I'm just going to recap some of those chapters, and Ed's going to recap some of those chapters. And so you can just sit back and relax and kind of listen to this story from Josephus, and then we'll get into chapter 9, hopefully tonight. So basically these chapters kind of cover a period in the 2nd century BC, the Maccabean revolt, and a little bit of the history that led up to this revolt by the Maccabees. Okay, so basically this was during the time that the Greek Empire was dominating the world at that time, and especially Judah. Of course, Cyrus had made provisions for Cyrus and Antiochus and Darius had made provisions for the Jews to go back and rebuild their temple and restore Jerusalem and all of that. And during that time, the Greeks kind of took over and started to Hellenize the area, including the area of Jerusalem. Let's see. We notice that in our Bible canons, that whole period, like the Greek period, is missing. It's just gone. There's, as a Protestant, I just thought there was 400 years of silence, basically, between the time of Ezra and Nehemiah up until the time of the Gospels when Matthew opens up there. And we know, so it kind of ends during the Persian Empire and picks up into the Roman Empire at some point. We see in John chapter 10 that Jesus is going to this feast. And this is John chapter 10, starting in verse 22, says, "Now it was the feast of dedication in Jerusalem, and it was winter. And Jesus walked in the temple in Solomon's porch. And then the Jews surrounded him and said to him, 'How long do you keep us in doubt? If you are the Christ, tell us plainly.'" So that section occurs basically during this time of year in Jerusalem. And there's no record of that, of the Feast of Dedication, anywhere in our Bible canons. So again, the reason why we think there's this 400-year period of silence, which I had thought as a Protestant was because of the disobedience of the Jews, that God had just, left them flapping in the breeze, except for the fact that we see in Daniel this period is, predicted. Alexander the Great is predicted, and the 4 generals are predicted. All of that stuff is spoken about, but there's just nothing, written about it really after Daniel. And then of course Revelation goes back to talk about it too. But all we have are those kind of apocalyptic writings about it, and no history. Well, there is history if you're not a canon buff. Of course, in the writings of Josephus, which of course we're not is not claiming that it's an inspired writing at all, but it is a great piece of history, and also First and Second Maccabees. That also covers this time period as well. And so, Trent was saying one of the things the Heavenly Family is doing is kind of filling in holes for us, and one of the holes that they're filling in for us is this period of time, between basically the Persian Empire and the time of Christ. We've got the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Qumran community, the Essenes, the Teacher of Righteousness, the Community Rule, and even all this stuff of the Maccabees and even the history of Josephus is really filling in and helping our minds understand what it was to be a Christian in the time of the Gospels, so we can understand the apostles better and Jesus Christ better and all of that. So this is really an important thing. And on top of all that, the Maccabean revolt was a critical time in history, because if not for the bravery of the Maccabees or the Hasmoneans, and the other devout Jews at that time, there would be no Jerusalem. There would be no temple. There would be nothing left for Jesus to come to when he was born. And so if not for the bravery of these people, history could be a lot different. So we owe a lot to these people, and we can learn a lot from these people as well. Let's see. Right. In the traditional today, most Jews will celebrate Hanukkah with, of course, the menorah. They call this festival the Festival of Lights, which Josephus also calls it the Festival of Lights as well. Hanukkah in Hebrew actually means dedication, which is what the Gospel of John calls it, the Feast of Dedication, because this was when the temple was dedicated. And Judas Maccabeus made it law that this festival would be kept annually from thenceforth, And so the Jews do seem to do that. I will say that the Jewish traditions of the menorah and the miracle of the oil in the lamp when they restored the temple, all that is not found in the Maccabees. It's not found in the writings of Josephus either. It comes from a tradition centuries later in the Talmud in a chapter called Shabbat 21b, and I have not read the Talmud, so that's all I know about that. But the focus in Josephus' writings is not on the menorah, which is not even, that's an eight candlestick lamp versus the menorah is a 7 candlestick lamp. So the menorah is based on the eight days of the feast and how the oil lasted 8 days. So it's not even meant to be a representation of the candlestick that was in the holy place. And so anyway, really the focus really needs to be on the abomination of desolation committed by Antiochus and the altar that was restored by Judas Maccabeus, and the purification of the temple and restoring the temple service the way it was supposed to be celebrated. Okay, so Book 12 of the Antiquities of the Jews, written by Josephus, is a period of time that covers the death of Alexander the Great to the death of Judas Maccabeus. So we're going to find ourselves in the midst of that book, starting in chapter 4. Go ahead.
So you can tell them how to find so they can read along.
Oh, good idea. Yeah, Trent posted in the Branch Davidian Facebook page a link to what we're going to read tonight. But you can go to www.earlyjewishwritings.com. You can scroll to Josephus, Antiquities of the Jews, Book 12, and then you can open to chapter 9 is where we'll be reading from tonight.
We may not get all the way there or whatever, but at least you'll know where it is, or if you want to read it later or whatever. And also understand, like Josephus, what this is, the Antiquity of the Jews, is a historical account. So every book of Antiquity of the Jews is a different period of time. So we're in Book 12, and like Mary said, it's the death of Alexander the Great all the way to the period of Judas Maccabeus to his death.
Okay. And so Josephus, just to describe him really quick, he was a Jewish general from 66 to 73 A.D. He participated in the Jewish revolt. The revolt ended in the Battle of Masada in 73 A.D., but Josephus actually surrendered to the Romans before this time. He was in Galilee, and so he surrendered to the Romans early on. He became a translator between the Roman and the Jewish forces. He was a witness to the destruction of the temple in year 70. He was adopted into the Roman royal family, and he wrote the History of the Jews, his autobiography, The Jewish Wars, and the Antiquities of the Jews, which is a 20-volume series. And this Josephus, his writings are very, very valuable to us because there's just incredible, he had an incredible education. The circumstances that he's under is really interesting, being a Jew, being, privy to the destruction, being part of the Jewish revolt, and then being a translator between the Romans and the Jews, and the time that these writings took place. And the cool thing is that the Romans, when they, not that this is cool, but they desecrated the temple, they destroyed the temple, of course. They didn't desecrate it, they destroyed it, which is desecration, I guess. But they took the temple records with them. And so these temple records were at Josephus's disposal, that he could write the history of the Jews. And so weirdly, if he hadn't traded sides, if you will, we probably wouldn't have access to these writings today. And so I'm sure because he was a Jew, he was very interested in writing a historical account of his people. And it's just a very, very interesting thing that occurred there. So that's really cool. Oh, yes, and the 400 years of silence really is a product of the idea of a Bible canon, and the canon is what caused this idea of the years of silence. But Josephus didn't share this idea, of course. So basically his writings, pick up where Ezra and Nehemiah kind of leave off. And so I think last year we started in Book 12, Chapter 4.
I think we started in Chapter 5 in Hanukkah.
Okay. Okay, Chapter 5, right?
Yeah, on the first day of Hanukkah last year we started in Chapter 5.
Okay. So just to review Chapter 4 a little bit, overview, we've had the death of Onias, who was the high priest, from 240 into 218 BC. The priesthood was then left to his son, Simon II. That was from 218 to 185 BC. And then the priesthood went to his son, Onias III, from 185 to 175 BC. And then the next priest should have been Onias III's son, who was Onias IV, but he was just an infant at the time. So the priesthood went to Onias III's brother, whose name was Jesus, and he changed his name to Jason. And then there was a rival priest to Jason whose name was also Onias. I don't know what relation he was to Onias III or Onias IV, but it seems like he was outside of that clan. He changed his name to Menelaus, and Menelaus ends up taking over the priesthood. It should have gone to Onias III's son, as I said, Onias IV, but he was an infant. And so again, the priesthood had gone to Jason, who was Onias III's brother. And so Menelaus takes over the priesthood, and Josephus talks about him, Menelaus, and the sons of Tobias going to Antiochus Epiphanes, who was the king of that area at that time, and he told him that they wanted to leave the Jewish laws and leave the Jewish way of living, and they wanted to adopt the Grecian laws and the Grecian ways. They wanted permission to build a gymnasium, if you remember, in Jerusalem, and that it even talks about them having a way to reverse circumcisions. You remember they were naked in the gymnasiums, and of course if they were circumcised, they would have stood out like a sore thumb. And so they had, don't ask me how, and it doesn't explain how they would reverse back in those days, circumcisions to make them look more like Greeks. So anyway, they were just leaving the ways of their forefathers. And this account, by the way, is in disagreement with the account in 2 Maccabees. In this case, in Josephus, Menelaus, is the one who wants to build a gymnasium. In Maccabees, it's actually Jason. So that was the priest that was before him. So they have basically the players kind of transposed a little bit here, which is quite a big difference, but there's a lot of similarities in the two stories. And Trent was saying last year that this shows that these two accounts are not solely dependent upon each other. So the things that they agree upon really give us multiple independent witnesses. So basically, these two stories are not in cahoots with each other, obviously. And so really the things that they share, it shows us that these are two independent witnesses of the things that did happen, which is really good, because I suppose ultimately, I don't know how much it matters which one of the priests end up wanting to Hellenize Jerusalem. One of them did, clearly, and the rest of the stuff is the same. So that's pretty cool. All right, and then on to chapter 5, paragraph 4. There's a series of events in 167 BC when Antiochus Epiphanes comes into Jerusalem now. He ends up desecrating the sanctuary. He takes the objects of the sanctuary, the secret treasures. He sacrifices a pig on the altar. He forbids the daily sacrifices from taking place. He builds idol altars for daily sacrifices instead. Instead, he forbids circumcisions of the sons of the Jews. And he basically brings an end to Judaism. He tortured those that were non-compliant, and he destroyed all the books of the law. And Leroy actually mentioned last year that this was kind of a parallel to the mark of the beast, and Trent agreed, which is a really interesting comment. Basically, the state determining what laws we're going to follow. And of course, the choices that the Jews had to either go with God or save their skins. So here comes Mattathias, okay, and he is a priest. He was the one, basically, that started the revolt. He was the father of Judas Maccabeus. Maccabeus, by the way, means the hammer, and it was really a nickname for Judas, and so the Maccabees were just kind of coined this, probably like you would coin a sports team, the Lions or something like that, you know. But Mattathias was his father, and he started the revolt. He was a priest, and so basically Antiochus was calling the Jewish priests at that time to sacrifice outside of the law of Yahweh, right, to sacrifice unclean animals on the idol altars. And Mattathias refused to do this. And one of the king's generals named Apelles was compelling them to sacrifice on these idol altars, and Mattathias and his sons came into the temple and killed the unfaithful priests who were cowards and caving to Apelles, and they also killed Apelles. So this is what Mattathias and his sons did. And basically, he garnered the troops. He got him, his sons, and a bunch of other Jews that were faithful Jews on his side to the law of Yahweh. They ran out into the desert. They hid in caves where they were free to keep their religion. Again, this sounds strikingly familiar to certain upcoming events. And they were, they actually, in these caves, they ended up getting killed, many of them, on Sabbaths, because the Jews, as you remember from last year, refused to fight on the Sabbath because it was the Sabbath, so they weren't going to fight. And then the Greeks figured out, if we attack them on the Sabbath, they're just sitting ducks, and we can kill them all. So Mattathias saw that this was going to be, obviously, the end of the revolt and the end of the ways of God if they didn't do something. So he gave a speech convincingly arguing that the Jews, the faithful Jews, should fight on the Sabbath if they are attacked. We talked about this a little bit last year about, the higher principle, which was, of course, basically restoring the law of God and protecting it from the enemy. So Mattathias gathered a great army, and he overthrew the various idol-worshipping altars. He killed those who broke the laws of Yahweh. He took the Jewish children and boys, and he circumcised them, and a great reform was then taking place. And this began the Maccabean revolt. So then we came to chapter 6, and this covers the period of time. This whole thing is like from 170 to 160 BCE, that kind of area. Let's see. I'll review. Okay, so this, by the way, this Maccabean dynasty in Judea at that time, it's called the Hasmonean dynasty. So if you ever hear of the Hasmonean dynasty, it's basically speaking of the dynasty created by the Maccabees. So it was headed by Mattathias and his 5 sons. Mattathias died. He died, and then his son Simon and Judas carried on the revolt. Mattathias died in 165 BC. He died, according to Josephus, of distemper. We're not really sure what distemper means. Does it mean just some type of general sickness? He died kind of a peaceful death as someone that's sick, so he wasn't killed in battle or anything, but when he was sick, he had time to give counsel to his sons. So that occurred in 165. Judas Maccabeus ended up dying in 160 BCE, which was 5 years later. But anyway, okay, so in response to this revolt, Antiochus sent Lysias to destroy Jerusalem and to abolish the nation. And then actually prior to this, a group of Samaritans and Cilisyrians also came against the Maccabeans. Lysias was the governor of the kingdom. He was supposed to wipe out the Jews. And this is now we're in, these dates are kind of hard to follow for me. Now we're in 165 BC at the start of chapter 7, which is the 147th year of the Seleucid dynasty for the Greeks. There's this one, I wanted to bring up one thing in chapter 7. Okay, I'm actually going to read it because it's better than my summary of it. Hold on. And I wanted to bring this out because I just thought it was so interesting in relation to us today. So let's see, Judas. Now this is from Judas Maccabeus. Let's see. I'm going to start in verse 299, it looks like. This is in chapter 7. There came also to them auxiliaries out of Syria and the country round about them, also many of the runagate Jews, and besides these came some merchants to buy those that should be carried captives, having bonds with them to bind those that should be made prisoners, with that silver and gold which they were to pay for their price. And when Judas saw their camp and how numerous their enemies were, he persuaded his own soldiers to be of good courage, and exhorted them to place their hopes of victory in God, and to make supplication to him according to the custom of their country, clothed in sackcloth, and to show what was their usual habit of supplication in the greatest dangers, and thereby to prevail with God to grant you the victory over your enemies. So he set them in their ancient order of battle used by their forefathers under their captains of thousands and their officers, and dismissed such as were newly married, as well as those that had newly gained possessions, that they may not fight in a cowardly manner, out of an inordinate love of life, in order to enjoy those blessings. When he had thus disposed his soldiers, he encouraged them to fight by the following speech which he made to them. O my fellow soldiers, no other time remains more opportune than the present for courage and contempt of dangers. For if you now fight manfully, you may recover your liberty, which is a thing of itself agreeable to all men. it proves to be to us much more desirable by its affording us the liberty of worshiping God. Since, therefore, you are in such circumstances at present, you must either recover that liberty and so regain a happy and blessed way of living, which is that according to our laws and the customs of our country, or to submit to the most opprobrious sufferings, nor will any seed of your nation remain. If you are defeated in this battle, fight therefore manfully, and suppose that you must die, though you do not fight, but believe that, besides such glorious rewards as those of the liberty of your country, of your laws, of your religion, you shall then obtain everlasting glory. Prepare yourselves, therefore, and put yourselves into such an agreeable posture that you may be ready to fight with the enemy as soon as it is tomorrow morning. And this is a speech which Judas made to encourage them. So that's quite a speech. And I just think it's so applicable to us today. You know, a lot of us in this message are really, you know, so a lot of us are at a point where, you know, we're not, that I know of, newly married. Maybe some are, and I'm not saying someone that is newly married or has come all of a sudden upon great possessions shouldn't be in this message. I'm not saying that. But it's interesting how he disposed of those types. If you were not ready to give everything to this battle, he didn't want them in his army, because he knew they wouldn't fight courageously, and there's nothing worse really than a coward next to you in battle. And so I just think that's just a really interesting speech, and I just thought that would be encouraging to all of us today. Many of us are in great positions to really give up our lives, and that's what I think the Heavenly Family is asking us to do, whether, you know, that be symbolically or actually doing that.
He's really saying the people who have a passion and a love for the next life, for the heavenly life, mm-hmm. are the ones who are going to really, you know, fight to keep the ways of their God. You know, as opposed to somebody who has great possessions or just got married or whatever, and they're really loving and enjoying this life. He wanted people to fight for a love of the next life, you know.
Okay. Are you ready for your summary?
Yeah, so that was chapter 7. So what we're doing here is we haven't started chapter 9 yet, so I'm going to do a little bit of a more thorough review of chapter 8 just to kind of get us prepared for chapter 9. And I'm not sure, what time is it?
8:31.
Okay, yeah, we'll have some time, I think, to get into chapter 9. So this is a review of, again, Book 12, Chapter 8. This chapter is just full of warfare and battles. And so if you read through it, it can be a little bit confusing. And I'm just going to kind of give an overview of it. At the start of this, basically, we had Judas had just conquered lots of nations, and he had really gained a lot of power for Judea. The surrounding nations and even the nations further out than that really kind of feared Judas and his armies, feared the Jews. They fought passionately, just like Mary had just read that speech, and we just talked that they were fighting for their way of life, for their way of worship in the temple, for their God, and they had great passion, felt that their victory was really worthwhile for their people and for their God, and that they also appeared to all these nations to have a God that was behind them, helped them in battle. They often had victories over armies that were way larger than they were, outnumbered them 2 to 1 often, or even greater than that sometimes, and they were still victorious. So anyway, what ended up happening is the very surrounding nations, because of this fear, knew that they couldn't come in with military might and conquer them or whatever. So they sort of started banding together and almost sort of doing guerrilla warfare. They were like attacking the edges of Judea and so on. The way that Josephus put it, they would lay snares and they would have secret conspiracies, and that through that they would gain an advantage. And they were killing a lot of the Jews, again, along the borders and so on. So Judas, kind of just wasn't happy about that. So he got together his army again, and he conquered all these surrounding lands. I mean, basically any of the countries that were participating in this guerrilla warfare, he just went and attacked them and, again, destroyed them. Up to this point, we'll see what happens in chapter 9, but up to this point, Judas, as a general, I don't think had any losses. I think everything has been a conquering, win. So again, he went and conquered these nations. Well, that kind of scared the nations that were a little further out, and they started to conspire, to gather large military forces and to organize. And they were attacking the Jews that were in the outlying areas that weren't necessarily in Judea. And Judas found out about this, of course, and so he realized he needed to organize and take care of this problem also, because eventually they were going to gather enough forces, to have a great number of people to come and attack Judea. This is not a good time to be alive, right? I mean, there was just, the Jews were being attacked constantly. They basically were being attacked or just attacking people that wanted to attack them or were about to attack them. So it's just crazy when you're reading through these chapters, just one battle after another battle, and in a short period of time. So anyway, Judas realizing, okay, I'm going to have to take care of these nations. He sent Simon, who was one of his brothers, with 3,000 men to assist the Jews that were in Galilee, and during his battles, which you can read about in chapter 8, he ended up defeating Tyre and Ptolemais. So he had great victories. So Simon, his brother, was very successful. And then Judas and another of Judas's brothers, Jonathan, they went out with 8,000 people, and they fought in the land of Gilead. And they ended up, as you read on, defeating Timotheus. And Judas, he left Joseph, who was the son of Zacharias, and Azarias, who was just another general. They left all the remaining forces. So you had 3,000 that went to Galilee, 8,000 that went to Gilead, and then the remaining Jewish forces were had the generals Joseph and Azarias. And they were to stay behind. They were ordered by Judas to not participate in any fighting or battles, but just stay behind right there to kind of protect the homeland. Now, while Judas and Simon were out doing their thing, Joseph and Azarias, who again were generals, decided they wanted to partake in these great victories that were going on. They kind of wanted some wins under their belt, so they decided to go out with some of the forces and to go ahead and do battle. So Simon and his forces had great victories. Judas and Jonathan and his forces had great victories. And Joseph and Azarias, who were commanded to stay behind, did not obey. And they went out and they ended up meeting. They went to the land of Gemnia, and they met a powerful general named Gorgias, and Gorgias defeated 2,000 of their men and backed them back into Judea. So the balance of the men and Joseph and Azarias ended up getting back into Judea, and that was really because they didn't obey it. Judas knew that that they shouldn't have gone into battle, or he would have sent them into battle. So they didn't obey him, and they ended up losing 2,000 men. Judas, in spite of this, kept on fighting. He had some other great victories. And chapter 8 ends with Judas finally coming back to Judea. And now we're ready to start into chapter 9. Okay. So do you think, should we ask if people have questions about anything, what you covered or what I covered? Or?
Yeah, sure. I know that was a lot of information. That was quite a recap there. Any questions or comments on, or anything else that you remember from last year that you would like to add to that? Sounds like no. So we are going to then start up in chapter 9. And Ed, you're going to read it?
I can start reading. We just want to do one paragraph at a time?
Yeah, sure.
So in the Antiquities of the Jews, each chapter starts off with a little kind of a summary. And I guess I'm not sure if it was Josephus himself that wrote this little summary, or if this was added later, or even maybe added by whoever published this particular version that we're reading. But it says, so this again is a little blurb that summarizes chapter 9. Concerning the death of Antiochus Epiphanes, how Antiochus Epitor fought against Judas and besieged him in the temple, and afterwards made peace with him and departed, of Alchemus and Ananias. Okay, so Book 12, Chapter 9, Paragraph 1. About this time it was that King Antiochus, as he was going over the upper countries, heard that there was a very rich city in Persia called Elymais, and therein a very rich temple of Dinah, and that it was full of all sorts of donations dedicated to it, as also weapons and breastplates, which upon inquiry he found had been left there by Alexander, the son of Philip, king of Macedonia. And being incited by these motives, he went in haste to Elymais and assaulted it and besieged it. But as those that were in it were not terrified by his assault, nor at his siege, but opposed him very courageously, he was beaten off his hopes, for they drove him away from the city, and went out and pursued after him, inasmuch as he fled away as far as Babylon, and lost a great many of his army. And when he was grieving for his disappointment, some persons told him of the defeat of his commanders, whom he had left behind him to fight against Judea, and what strength the Jews had already gotten. When this concern about these affairs was added to the former, he was confounded, and by the anxiety he was in, fell into a distemper. That's interesting, because here we have the word distemper again.
Yeah.
But he fell into a distemper, which as it lasted a great while, and as his pains increased upon him, so he at length perceived he should die in a little time. So he called his friends to him, and told them that his distemper was severe upon him, and confessed withal that this calamity was sent upon him for his miseries he had brought upon the Jewish nation, while he plundered their temple and condemned their God. And when he had said this, he gave up the ghost. Whence one may wonder at Polybius of Megalopolis, who thought otherwise a good man, yet saith that Antiochus died because he had a purpose to plunder the temple of Dinah in Persia. For the proposing to do a thing, but not actually doing it, is not worthy of punishment. But if Polybius could think that Antiochus thus lost his life on that account, it is a much more probable that the king died on account of the sacrilegious plundering of the temple in Jerusalem. But we will not contend about this matter with those who may think that the cause assigned by this Polybius of Megalopolis is nearer the truth than that assigned by us. So obviously we have Josephus kind of pontificating a little bit about what was going on there. So are there any comments about paragraph 1? And again, you just see more, like the Jewish people were able to defend themselves again.
So I guess the whole point at the end here is just saying that shouldn't put too much weight on what Polybius of Megalopolis is saying, right? That Antiochus died because he was trying to destroy the temple of Diana in Persia, which is a foreign god, right? But rather that it's because of his destroying the temple at Jerusalem.
Yeah, that's how I take it. And that's, again, like Mary had pointed out earlier, it's important to remember that basically Josephus was a Jew, so he would have a Jewish bias.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Well, and like Mary just said, possibly, but most likely. Does anybody else have any comments?
So we don't know what distemper means? It's a sickness of some sort that causes pain, is what we see so far.
Right. Yeah, it's looking like distemper is just basically you're going to die. I mean, in both cases, when Mattathias had distemper, it just meant he knew he was about to die. And obviously in this case, here we have, who is it that has distemper?
It was Mattathias had it, and then Antiochus has it.
Antiochus has it, right? Okay, yeah. And his was brought on by anxiety, and it looks just like some kind of a sickness that's life-ending. It may encompass lots of different illnesses that are life-threatening. So anyway,
thanks.
Are there any other comments or questions?
I just looked up distemper in humans, and again, I don't know, back in when Josephus was writing this after the destruction of Jerusalem, I don't know what distemper meant, but it says here in Wikipedia, canine distemper can infect humans. When it infects humans, it's known as Paget's disease. It increases the production of osteoclasts. I don't know what an osteoclast is, but again, I think we were talking last year that it just might just be a general term for consumption or that kind of wasting away.
Okay. There's a footnote kind of thing, number 23, it says, right? If we're reading this online. It looks interesting.
Okay.
Do you guys see that, number 23? Just before the last paragraph, it's like a footnote, and then if you click it, right? Okay, right where it says Antiochus died because he had a purpose to plunder the temple of Diana in Persia, for the purposing to do a thing, and then it says 23, but not actually doing it is not worthy of punishment. So if we click that, there's a little footnote that says, since St. Paul, a Pharisee, confesses that he had not known concupiscence or desires to be sinful, had not the 10th commandment said, thou shalt not covet, Romans 7:7, the case seems to have been much the same with our Josephus, who was of the same sect, that he had not a deep sense of the greatness of any sins that proceeded no further than the intention. However, since Josephus speaks here properly of the punishment of death, which is not intended by any law, either of God or man, for the bare intention, his words need not to be strained to mean that sins intended but not executed were no sins at all. So I guess that's kind of just telling us there that, Josephus's comment, it just expands more of Josephus's comment about, why Antiochus destroyed. The reason, why he died was because he destroyed the temple in Jerusalem.
He's saying that Antiochus wouldn't have gotten ill, because of, and had all this mental pain and everything by feeling sinful for not being able to defeat Diana in Persia, the temple of Diana in Persia, like he attacked it and failed, so he wouldn't have considered that to be a sin. Josephus wouldn't have. But Josephus would have considered him attacking the temple of God in Jerusalem, so that must be what the thing is that so compelled him to become ill. So
exactly,
his understanding of sin. So yeah, that's good. I'm glad you read that. I actually have the book, and it's not footnoted the same way, but that same footnote comes up with an asterisk. So, okay, so I'm going to start chapter 2. Chapter 9, paragraph 2. However, Antiochus, before he died, called for Philip, who was one of his companions, and made him the guardian of the kingdom, and gave him his diadem, and his garment, and his ring, and charged him to carry them, and deliver them to his son Antiochus, and desired him to take care of his education, and to preserve the kingdom for him. This Antiochus died in the 149th year, but it was Lysias, that declared his death to the multitude, and appointed his son Antiochus to be king, of whom at present he had the care, and called him Eupator. Yeah, Eupator. So Antiochus, before he died, assigned Philip to sort of be the
interim king.
The interim king, right? And his son was also Antiochus.
Yeah, he was just supposed to be the interim king until he could deliver the kingdom to Antiochus' son, Antiochus.
But it looks like that didn't end up happening. This Lysias ended up declaring that his son, would take the rule right away. So I'm reading this that Philip never had the kingdom, right?
This Antiochus died in 149th year, but it was Lysias that declared his death to the multitude and appointed his son Antiochus to be king. I wonder what year. So Antiochus died in 149.
Well, that's 149
of the reign of the Seleucidae.
Right.
So that's not 149 BC. Obviously.
Right. So are there any questions or comments about that one?
Want to read the footnote there?
I see that. Okay. And desired him to take care of his education and to preserve the kingdom for him. Okay. So that footnote says, no wonder that Josephus here describes Antiochus Eupator as young and wanting tuition. When he came to the crown, since Appian informs us, and that's some other literature called Syriac, page 177, that he was then but 9 years old. But it looks to me like at 9 years old he took control of the kingdom, that this Philip ended up not. Lysias was a general, so he probably had quite a bit of power. So anyway, maybe if we read on, we'll find out something else about that. Okay, so moving on to chapter 3. I'm sorry, I'm doing that again. Chapter 9, paragraph 3. At this time, it was that the garrison in the citadel of Jerusalem with the Jewish runagates did a great deal of harm to the Jews, for the soldiers that were in the garrison rushed out upon the sudden and destroyed such that were coming up to the temple in order to offer their sacrifices. For this citadel adjoined to and overlooked the temple. When these misfortunes had often happened to them, Judas resolved to destroy that garrison, whereupon he got all the people together and vigorously besieged those that were in the citadel. This was in the 115th year of the domain of the Seleucidae. So he made engines of war and erected bulwarks and very zealously pressed on to take the citadel. But there were not a few of the renegades who were in the place that went out by night to the country and got together some other wicked men like themselves and went to Antiochus the king and desired of them that he would not suffer them to be neglected under the great hardships that lay upon them from those of their own nation. And this because their sufferings were occasioned on his father's account, while they left the religious worship of their fathers and preferred that which had been commanded them to follow, that there was danger lest the citadel and those appointed to garrison it by the king should be taken by Judas and those that were with him, unless he would send them succors. And Antiochus, who was but a child, heard this. He was angry and sent for the captains and his friends and gave order that they should get an army of mercenaries together with such men also of his own kingdom as were of an age fit for war. Accordingly, an army was collected of about 100,000 footmen and 20,000 horsemen and 32 elephants.
Sounds like basically the renegade Jews still wanting to be Hellenistic and complaining about their being
forced into Jewish customs.
Yeah, they didn't care for what Judas and the Jews aligned to Yahweh, how they were attacking them. And so they make a complaint back to the young Antiochus, I guess, who is the king now. And young Antiochus is mad and gathers a huge army with elephants. So, ...
So he's going to fight against Judas, right?
Yeah, sounds so.
Wow. This Judas guy really has to fight a lot of battles, huh?
Yeah.
All right, so here we go, paragraph 4 of chapter 9. Is there anyone else that would like to read, just by the way?
These words are so challenging.
Okay, well, I'll keep going here. So the king took his army and marched hastily out of Antioch with Lysias, who had commanded of the whole, and came to Idumea, and thence went up to the city Bethshura, a city that was strong, and not to be taken without great difficulty. He set about this city and besieged it, and while the inhabitants of Bethshura courageously opposed him, and sailed out upon him, and burnt his engines of war, a great deal of time was spent in the siege. But when Judas heard of the king's coming, he raised the siege of the citadel, and met the king, and pitched his camp in certain straits at a place called Beth Zechariah, at the distance of 70 furlongs from the enemy. But the king soon drew his forces from Bethshura, and brought them to those straits. And as soon as it was day, he put his men in battle array, and made his elephants follow one another through the narrow passes, because they could not be set sideways by one another. Now round about every elephant there were 1,000 footmen and 500 horsemen. The elephants also had high towers upon their backs, and archers in them. And he also made the rest of his army go up the mountains, and put his friends before the rest. He gave orders for the army to shout aloud, and he attacked the enemy. He also exposed to sight their golden and brazen shields, so that a glorious splendor was sent from them. And when they shouted, the mountains echoed again. When Judas saw this, he was not terrified, but received the enemy with great courage, and slew about 600 of the first ranks. But when his brother Eleazar, whom they call Aran, saw the tallest of all the elephants armed with royal breastplates, and supposed that the king was upon him, he attacked him with great quickness and bravery. He also slew many of those that were about the elephant, and scattered the rest, and then went under the belly of the elephant, and smote him, and slew him. So the elephant fell upon Eleazar, and by his weight crushed him to death. And thus did this man come to his end, when he had first courageously destroyed many of his enemy.
Wow.
Sorry, so Eleazar is whose brother?
Eleazar is one of Judah's brothers. So Mattathias, I'm sorry. The ones I know I'm getting wrong now. Mattathias had 5 sons.
Right.
So Mattathias was the priest. His 5 sons were Eleazar, who's the one that just died, Simon, who was kind of a religious leader, and he was the one also that took the 3,000 men into
Galilee.
Into Galilee. And then there was John, who was also sometimes called Jonanan, and he's not talked about a whole lot. And then there was another one named Jonathan, and then, of course, there was Judas, who was called Judas Maccabeus eventually, and that's the Judas that we're reading about right now. So,
I had to ask because it was going so well, and then, wow, that's sad how he now died being crushed by the elephant that he slew.
Right.
I mean, obviously he knew he was going to die when he did that. Obviously.
That's a sad ending for him.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and actually, there wasn't a whole lot about Eleazar being talked about in these chapters, it seems like. It's all Judas, and, we've seen some Simon, and we've seen some Jonathan. And, that's really, Eleazar, for whatever reason, hasn't really been talked about a whole lot. I think Eleazar, I was trying to find some stuff about him, and it might have been from Wikipedia. I'm not sure where it was from, but it looked like he might have been the oldest of the sons. So, anyway, is there any other comments on paragraph 4? So maybe we'll read paragraph 5 and then just stop there. We've been on for a little over an hour. But I'm curious if Judas says anything about his brother or whatever here, so read one more paragraph.
Eleazar and related to the three states?
He's one of Judah Maccabeus' brothers.
Oh, really? Oh, thank you.
Okay, so paragraph 5. But Judah, seeing the strength of the enemy, retired to Jerusalem and prepared to endure a siege. As for Antiochus, he set apart his army to Bethshura to besiege it, and with the rest of his army he came against Jerusalem. But the inhabitants of Bethshura were terrified at his strength, and seeing that their provisions grew scarce, they delivered themselves up on the security of oaths that they should suffer no hard treatment from the king. And when Antiochus had thus taken the city, he did them no other harm than seeing them out naked. He also placed a garrison of his own in the city. But as for the temple of Jerusalem, he lay at its siege a long time, while they within bravely defended it. For what engines soever the king set against them, they set other engines again to oppose them. But then their provision failed them. What fruits of the ground they had laid up were spent, and the land being not plowed that year continued unsowed, because it was the 7th year, in which by our laws we are obliged to let it lie uncultivated. And withal, so many of the besieged ran away for want of necessities, that but a few only were left in the temple. Wow.
Makes you want to read more.
Yeah, read one more paragraph.
Read one more?
Yes, we're hanging.
I have to tell you, one more is the last paragraph. Oh, no, it's not. No, it's not. Okay.
Well, let's just finish it. Yeah, there's just 6 and 7.
Okay. All right. And these happened to be the circumstances of which as were besieged in the temple. But then, because Lysias, because Lysias, the general of the army, and Antiochus, the king, were informed that Philip was coming upon them out of Persia, and was endeavoring to get the management of the public affairs to himself, they came to these sentiments, to leave the siege, and to make haste to go up against Philip. Yet they did resolve not to let this be known to the soldiers or the officers. This is interesting. They're talking about Philip here. So obviously, while young Antiochus was king, Philip was kind of running the affairs.
It sounds like he was snubbed and
yeah,
kind of coming back to get back what he thought he deserved.
Okay. All right, not the result. Okay. But the king commanded Lysias to speak openly to the soldiers and the officers without saying a word about the business of Philip, and to intimate to them that a siege would be very long, that the place was very strong, and that they were already in want of provisions, that many affairs of the kingdom wanted regulation, and that it was much better to make a league with the besieged and to become friends to their whole nation by permitting them to observe the laws of their fathers while they broke out into war only because they were deprived of them, and so to depart home. When Lysias discoursed thus with them, both the army and the officers were pleased with this resolution.
Wow.
So that's interesting. So, like Judas had all these great victories, and then now it looks like he's defeated, and they kind of make peace. Because
of Philip's coming back.
Yeah.
He's going to take the management of the public affairs to himself, and so Lysias decides that that's a more important battle to fight, and he basically convinces his army, without telling them any of this, that, this war is not that important. We're kind of running low on supplies, and we've got more important matters, so let's make friends with these people and let them carry on with the laws of their God, and let's be on our way.
Okay, so Philip, this is now giving us a little insight of what happened to Philip. So does it look like he defected kind of thing and became a traitor, or?
I kind of take it, and I don't know. It says these were the circumstances then, because Lysias, the general of the army, and Antiochus, the king, were informed that Philip was coming out of Persia and was endeavoring to get the management of the public affairs to himself. They came to the sentiments to leave the siege, obviously at the temple, and to make haste to go against Philip. So it sounds like back in paragraph 2, Antiochus Epiphanes was, before he died, wanted Philip to basically raise his son and be the interim king, and then looks like that little plan got circumvented.
Was circumvented by...
It was Lysias. Yeah, Lysias. Then Lysias looks like that he made Antiochus the child to be the king, and doesn't really say what happened to Philip, but here Philip comes back on the scene.
And Philip was a general anyway. It was one of his. Oh no, it says it was one of his companions. Yeah, maybe he wasn't a general. Yeah, for whatever. I mean, he doesn't really expound on it, but obviously Philip was supposed to be taking care of the affairs of the kingdom and raising the new king, the young king, and instead he was in Persia, maybe because Lysias forced him to leave the land, but hearing that, young Antiochus was having trouble or whatever, and, the people were kind of revolting against his father being so demanding that they keep the Jewish traditions and everything, and then not wanting to, it was giving power to forces against the Jews, really. And because of that, I guess Philip came back and sort of said he'd take over, manage public affairs or whatever himself instead of the young king. And for whatever reason, it doesn't seem like the nature of Antiochus, but Antiochus was happy to, and maybe it was like Mary said, just because of the fact that their portions were, there was no food for them to eat, provisions were low, and
well, the provisions were low inside the temple, and so a lot of the Jews defected, right?
Well, no, and also they would eat the besieging army was eating from the fields that had no food. There was no food left. Because when an army attacks someone, they're eating the provisions of that land while they're attacking, As they conquer, they're getting plunder, right? So anyway.
Well, it says here in paragraph 6 that they were going to intimate to the troops that the siege would be long, that the place was very strong, which was not true, and that they were already in want of provisions. I guess I don't know if that's true or not. It makes it seem like it was an intimation, that word intimate. What does that mean?
Convey. This is the king in Lysias. Like the king told Lysias to talk to his own troops. These are the ones that are attacking the temple. Okay. And they're the ones wanting, basically Antiochus is wanting to pull out or wanting to just make a deal. Like, say, enough fighting. And to become friends to their whole nation by preventing them to observe the laws of their fathers while they broke out into war only because they were deprived of them, and so to depart home. So when Lysias had discoursed, talked to all of them, both the army and the officers were happy with the resolution. So, this is Antiochus's people that were happy with this decision that came down from Antiochus through Lysias. So anyway, maybe everybody's just getting sick of war. Are there any other comments or? All right, so let's finish up real quick here. So accordingly, the king sent to Judas and to those that were with him and promised to give them peace and to permit them to make use of and live according to the laws of their fathers, and they gladly received his proposals. And when they had gained security upon oath for their performance, they went out of the temple. But when Antiochus came into it and saw how strong the place was, he broke his oaths and ordered his army that was there to pluck down the walls to the ground. And when he had done so, he returned to Antioch. He also carried with him Ananias the high priest, who was also called Menelaus. For Lysias advised the king to slay Menelaus if he would have the Jews be quiet and cause him no further disturbance, for that this man was the origin of all the mischief the Jews had done them, by persuading his father to compel the Jews to leave the religion of their fathers. So the king sent Menelaus to Berea, a city of Syria, and there had him put to death, when he had been high priest for 10 years. He had been a wicked and impious man, and in order to get the government to himself, had compelled his nation to transgress their own laws. After the death of Menelaus, Alchemist, who was also called Jacomus, was made high priest. But when King Antiochus found that Philip had already possessed himself of the government, he made war against him and subdued him and took him and slew him. Now as to Ananias, the son of the high priest, who, as we before informed you, was left a child when his father died, when he saw that the king had slain his uncle Menelaus, he gave the high priesthood to Alchemist, who was not of the high priest's stock, but was induced by Lysias to translate the dignity from his family to another house. He fled Ptolemy, king of Egypt, and when he found he was in great esteem with him, and with his wife Cleopatra, he desired and obtained a place in the Nomus of Heliopolis, there you go, wherein he built a temple like to that of Jerusalem, of which therefore we shall thereafter give account in a place more proper for it.
Now, this Onias that we're talking of here was alluded to back in chapter 5 of Book 12. And if you remember, Onias III had a little boy, Onias IV, but he was too young to become the high priest. So Onias III's brother, Jesus, who renamed himself Jason, became the high priest. And then Onias/Menelaus, who's mentioned here, was the rival high priest, took over the priesthood, and was the one that went to Antiochus to inform him that he wanted to build a gymnasium in Jerusalem, do away with the laws of Yahweh, and to basically Hellenize the people, which is what Mattathias then revolted and started the whole revolt. So now it comes full circle. Josephus had said back in chapter 5 he was going to go on more about the infant Onias IV, and here we see is that place that Josias was referring to. So now he's all grown up, and he sees that Menelaus, which I'm surprised that he was the high priest all this time under Judas Maccabeus, but I suppose the high priest had to be a member of that family, I guess. So that, I guess, maybe, I don't know, maybe Judas Maccabeus felt like his hands were tied as far as getting a new high priest was concerned, because it was supposed to be, passed down from father to son, or at least stay in the family. So here we see Menelaus now, interestingly, is put to death. So he was reigning as high priest for 10 years, and then that was that for him. And then it looks like Onias, when he found out that the priesthood was given to Alchemist, who was not of his same family, he fled to Ptolemy, king of Egypt, and found esteem with him and Cleopatra, and then looks like he created a temple-like situation in Heliopolis, Nomus of Heliopolis, and looks like we're going to hear more of him later in that situation. So that's an interesting ending to that story.
Yes, that is.
I guess what goes around comes around, huh? At least for Menelaus. He was for the Greek way of life, and he ended up getting killed by the Greeks. Any other comments about chapter 9 or the last paragraph there?
Yeah, it looks like Philip became an enemy eventually.
Right. Yep.
Yeah.
He didn't last too long either. His little...
You have to remember that
So it sounds like when Antiochus was gone, Philip took over, possessed himself of the government, and then Antiochus came back and slew him. Very interesting ending.
But the Jews get to keep their way of life.
Yeah,
and
right.
It looks like we're kind of done with at least a priesthood that's supporting Hellenistic practices, at least for the moment, right?
Yeah, that's really interesting about Menelaus. It doesn't really tell us what he did during the Maccabean control. It just really seems odd to me. Does anyone recall anything about Menelaus? I mean, it's interesting, that he's the high priest and he was against the laws of Yahweh, and now was he forced to do sacrifices the proper way? I guess so, huh?
He may have just been a coward and just going with whatever he thought was a better way for him to survive,
Yeah, right. Well, so we can end it there. We've been on for an hour and 21 minutes. Would anyone, any further comments / would anyone like to close in prayer?
Yeah, I was just going to say that the very last sentence there, where who is it now here? Onias, right, when he fled to Egypt. So it looks like he built a temple like to that at Jerusalem. So it shouldn't be surprising, right, that there's a temple in Egypt that's dedicated to the Jews.
Interesting, yes. And Josephus is going to tell us more about that later in a place more proper for it. Maybe we can cheat and look ahead.
Go for it.
Yeah, we can look into that and bring our findings back tomorrow. So.
All right.
Would you pray, Anna?
Sure, yeah. Heavenly Family, we just want to praise you and thank you for this Sabbath day. You've given us a day of rest, which we truly need. And we also want to thank you for this story that does fill in a lot of gaps, a lot of stories we don't know, and we just we're looking forward to finding out the truth of all this and making the puzzle fit and the missing pieces fit in. So we just leave this in your hands and we trust your guidance. So be with us for the rest of the Sabbath. Thank you for everyone here. And we just want to always praise you in everything. Thank you. In the name of the branch, he and she, I pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Well, happy Sabbath, everyone. Lila Tov, and we'll talk tomorrow.
Great. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Oh.